So thank you all for watching today. We are joined by three of my wonderful colleagues to follow up on some of our question and answers from our two spring conferences, the African American Conference held in April and Updates on Dementia held in May. And I'm joined today by Stephanie Bonnegat, our Family Care Specialist, Craig Wingate, our Outreach Marketing Specialist, and Lisa Choquette, our Helpline Manager, who are going to help us answer some of these general questions that we get around Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So Craig, I'm going to start with you. You work in the realm of physician outreach and education. Why is it important to inform our physician about our medications and supplements that we're on?
So it's important to communicate with your physician because they need to know what's going on with you. So often as patients we don't connect with our physicians, and it might be because we only get to see them for 15 minutes or we don't see them that often, but in terms of next steps and sort of gauging where you are with the disease, it's important to continue to communicate with your physician and to let them know if medications are working, if they're not working, if there are any side effects, because they're going to be the primary person to sort of rearrange things that better fit you and your needs.
Absolutely. And we hear from physicians all the time that they really appreciate that conversation with their patients, that we oftentimes feel that we're bothering them, but physicians actually really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So Stephanie, I'm going to turn to you to talk a little bit. I get a question all the time about mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, versus dementia, or Alzheimer's disease. You might want to differentiate between both of them as well. Can you give us a little bit of background on that so our viewers will understand them better?
Yeah, sure. So mild cognitive impairment, which we shorten to MCI, is changes in cognitive function that are show up on tests that the doctor might do, but don't interfere with somebody's daily life. And so some of those areas you might see changes are in memory or language, mood or behavior, navigation, kind of orientation. But again, a person with mild cognitive impairment can still function and live independently in the community because they have coping mechanisms where they're able to continue living independently. Dementia are those changes in cognitive function that show up on tests and interfere with daily life. And dementia is an umbrella term. It's a category. It's a set of symptoms that are causing these changes in cognitive function. Alzheimer's disease is one of those diseases that causes change in cognitive function. So it is a form of dementia. It's the most common form of dementia, but there are many other different types of diseases that cause these symptoms of dementia, these changes in cognitive function. And each of these dementias have different progressions, they have different treatments, so it's important to find out what form of dementia that your loved one has.
And you mentioned about Alzheimer's disease, and we know a little bit more about Alzheimer's disease. One of the questions, Lisa, that I get all the time is about what is amyloid plaque? You hear about the hallmarks of the disease, but what does that actually mean?
So amyloid plaque, along with what we call the tangles, the tau protein, are the two hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. The amyloid plaque is a protein that builds up on the outside of the brain, that kind of clogs up the system, so to speak. It's a sticky kind of substance. It's a naturally occurring protein, but it seems to be toxic in the brain when it builds up in that way. The tau protein, the tangles, are a protein that accumulate on the inside of the brain cell. So the brain is actually being attacked both inside the brain cell and outside the brain cell, and that's what happens when someone has Alzheimer's disease, and as it builds up and spreads through the brain, that's where you see the deterioration of all parts of reasoning, functioning, cognitively, physically. All parts of the brain will eventually be affected.
Yeah, we know that oftentimes families don't get a diagnosis truly at the beginning of the onset of these symptoms, right? It's thought that a lot of times it takes about 3 or 5 years before families actually get to the physician for that diagnosis. So we get a lot of questions, Stephanie, about the medications and when do we start the use of those medications?
Great question. So there are 4 FDA-approved medications for Alzheimer's disease. Aricept, Exelon, and Razidine are FDA-approved for the early to middle stages. Namenda is approved for the moderate stages. So it's really important to consult with the physician and see where your loved one is in the disease process to decide which medication is best for them.
So we've heard, Lisa, you talk about the disease itself, what's actually happening in the brain. We've heard both you and Stephanie talk about the stages of the disease and how that changes. We get questions a lot about how do we know when it's time to stop including the person with the disease in decision making, if they should be included in the disease once they have the diagnosis. We know there's a loss, but yet there's still that need to remain independent. What advice do you give to families on that?
Well, I'd say first of all, when families call and they have concerns about a loved one that they think may have the disease or has been newly diagnosed, there's a lot of questions that come up surrounding decision making. My advice is that for a loved one who maybe has MCI or is in the early stage of Alzheimer's, you very much do want them involved in decision making. There may be a lot of decisions that need to be made that person has to be involved in, such as powers of attorney for healthcare, powers of attorney for finance, what are their wishes throughout their life. So you definitely, as a family, want to involve the individual who has dementia in those decisions so that both for their sake, that they feel comfortable, that they know their needs are being taken into account, but also for the family that they know that in advance, because we do know with Alzheimer's there will come a point where an individual may not have the ability to voice those concerns anymore. They may not understand questions posed to them and how to problem solve, and their judgment may be impacted.
The safety issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there may come a point for family or whoever is the primary caregiver for an individual to have to make some tough decisions that their loved one cannot be involved in because the disease has progressed. But I think our feeling is overall you want the individual who's affected by the disease to be able to be involved in decisions that will impact their life to the ability that they can.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. So as we wrap up this sort of general session answering questions, Stephanie, I'm just going to throw it to you. Just if you could give one piece of advice to anybody that's watching, what would it be?
So for people taking care of anyone with any form of dementia, my one piece of advice is get that self-care built into your daily routine at the beginning. If you wait too long, you'll not be able to get it in, or it'll be much harder to get self-care into your routine, and it's really important. We often say put your oxygen mask on first before you help somebody else, and self-care is your oxygen mask.
Thank you all for joining us.